I suspect that Keir Starmer's genuine view of the monarchy is that he thinks it's a bit of a silly institution that he's never been that much in favour of, but that he wouldn't wish to destabilise either his electoral chances or his time in office doing anything about. So it's a subject he just doesn't want to talk about particularly.
Meet the Cerberus of columnists, the Janus of journalism, and the ultimate political portmanteau of opinion.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Finkelvitch, with Daniel Finkelstein and David Aaronovitch on Times Radio.
Oh, it feels like it's been ages. It's been ages for one reason or another. But joining me in the studio is Danny Finkelstein. Morning, Danny.
Good morning. We've been here. It's you.
I know. I was off for a couple of weeks, and then before that, anyway.
But without you, it's merely the penultimate political portmanteau of political opinion.
And beaming in is David Aaronovitch. Morning, David. Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you too, Matt. I was just thinking, you know that thing about that you've got on at the moment, how you kind of carefully build something up and it all goes wrong at the last moment. I was thinking how Danny and I had carefully cultivated reputations as very serious columnists, and maybe, you know, some of the most reliable columnists and in Britain. And then you did that jingle.
I don't know how to break it to you, David, but that reputation might entirely be in your own head. I think the jingle is entirely in keeping with your long-standing reputations. Right, let's get stuck in. We've got this poll that YouGov have done for us, asking. I was trying to sort of get to the bottom of sort of sentiment. How are people feeling about the two parties? Because clearly, Labour do have a big lead in the polls. It doesn't really seem to be moving for the Tories. And they've asked over several elections, how would you feel if the Conservative or Labour Party won? Just 8% of people currently say they'd be delighted if the Tories won, having been more than a quarter ahead of the 27 and 2019 elections. Interestingly, almost half now say they'd be dismayed if the Conservatives won, and 26% wouldn't mind. So it's not particularly good news for the Conservatives. But on the Labour side, proportion of people who say they'd be delighted if Keir Starmer's Labour won, 22%. That's below the enthusiasm for Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 and 2019. And 26% say they wouldn't mind, 34% say they'd be dismayed if Labour won. Danny, I suppose it confirms what we sort of feel, which is that people are really unhappy about the Tory party, but not very excited about the Labour Party.
Yes, look, let's take the baseline of this. The Conservative Party at the moment is losing very badly in the opinion polls, and this just confirms that. But let's look at it with a slightly different eye. I guess, given how badly the Conservative Party has done in the last year, both in reality and in public opinion, there might be some comfort that the rate of dismay to not being so concerned is actually as good as it is.
Yeah.
So the one thing that I suppose that there are two things I'd take out of that poll if I were looking to. The first would be that there are more people than the Conservative Party might expect that are still sort of a bit indifferent about whether they get elected and not actually absolutely furious. The second thing is I wonder how good people are at predicting what their reaction would be if this were to happen in 2 or 3 years' time. A lot of people, they're being asked a question that is entirely in their sort of made up one of a pollster. I mean, not saying it's not a good scientific question. It's a very well-framed question and exactly what a pollster should do. But I'm just saying that I'm not sure people can give proper answers to that question. So those would be the two bits of comfort. But you can always take such comfort from polls. The broad lesson of it is the same as the broad lesson of the other polls, which is the Conservative Party could easily lose the next general election by a much bigger margin than people anticipate. And I think that's really quite a plausible outcome.
The flip side, I suppose, David, is that the lack of enthusiasm about the fact that there were fewer people who said they'd be delighted if Keir Starmer won than said the same of Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 and 2019.
I think we have to ask ourselves two questions about this in addition. The first is, what's this poll for? In other words, what is it you're seeking to understand from it with regard to the future? Do we seriously think that this kind of enthusiasm drop from the 2017 election would make a difference to how people would vote in the next general election. And I don't think we can say that. The second thing is, and this is more interesting to me, people remake the past according to what has happened. So if we take the 1997 Blair victory, what everybody imagines is that there was an incredible surge of enthusiasm for Tony Blair in the period of the New Labour, in the period before the 1997 election. Everybody said, we'd love to have them in government. And that if you'd asked this question back then, unfortunately it only starts in 2017, you'd have got, kind of enthusiasm, stratospheric enthusiasm levels. That just wasn't true. And in fact, the overwhelming kind of narrative, which was developed in the period before that, almost overwhelming, about Labour, was that it was interested in focus groups, and it didn't believe anything, and that Tony Blair was an actor, was a cipher, and all this kind of stuff. And you'd get people saying, well, I'm very kind of skeptical about him. He's all just a big grin and stuff like that. After the election, it was a completely different matter. It was reworked in people's minds for this moment of incredible, a new dawn has broken, has it not, etc. Became what everybody thought they had thought before the election. And I don't really think that was true. So those are the kind of two caveats that I would have. Should Labour necessarily be worried by a lack of enthusiasm? Well, it shouldn't be delighted by it, but nor is an incredible level of enthusiasm for the party that you end up voting for an absolutely necessary ingredient of your victory.
I'm not sure that I think enthusiasm is a very good political trait. I do want because I think optimism, positive thinking, a lack of fatalism, those things are important. A degree of trust is important. Enthusiasm, I think, often reflects. Sometimes it reflects unreality, and sometimes it reflects a sort of zeal and dislike that I find actually rather a dangerous property.
You do, if there was a sort of general sense that normal people were looking forward to and talking about a Labour government enthusiastically, that could create a sense of inevitability, which currently doesn't.
I know what people were enthusiastic about on the morning after Tony Blair got elected. It wasn't Tony Blair, it was getting rid of the Conservatives. And Tony Blair brought that about and, gradually speaking, associated himself with it over the next few months. But that morning, there was that feeling of getting rid of the Conservatives. I would say that it's quite widespread, that feeling now, but probably less intense. That would be my estimation. The bigger problem for the Conservative Party is that in 1997 the economy wasn't doing as badly as it is now, and actually the economy is a big driver of elections. So you could get a less antipathetic electorate producing a worse result for the Conservative Party. However, zeal and enthusiasm sounds as though it's a property that you definitely want, but it's has its bad points.
Maybe the answer, David, is that either Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer should come out and start talking about how Prince Harry's book.
Well, I was just thinking that Danny Finkelstein should actually now publish a book entitled An Attack on Enthusiasm, or Down with Enthusiasm, and so on. In fact, that'd make a really good column, and I would certainly read it, as I do all Danny's columns. Is this your attempt to segue into the Harry question?
I was tempted to seamlessly segue, but once again, you've shone a spotlight on the. You've taken listeners behind the curtain.
Yeah, I mean, well, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about is not because I want either any of the three of us to give us our opinions about Harry's book. God alone knows you've got enough of that going on, etc., and people don't need it from us. But the thing that I was interested thinking about this, and I wanted to ask Danny because he's been, in a sense, closer to politicians themselves than I have been and their calculations, is that here's one group of people who hasn't said anything about the Harry book. And the Harry thing, and that has been our senior politicians. They have been absolutely notable by their total quietness about it. And what I wanted to ask Danny was this: why have they been so quiet? What is the calculation or the feeling that senior politicians have with regard to furores about the royal family?
Oh, that's good. Well, I mean, of course, at one point, political contention between parties was about the royal family, and so usually you'd have the opposition party, which was the party of the Prince of Wales, opposing the governing party, which was the party of the King, and that was politics. So I guess that if you're the Conservative Party, you don't want to. First of all, they've got enough on their hands, and it's not sure they can really bring that much useful to this. But secondly, they don't want to. Destabilise the monarchy, point to things that are problematic, and if the monarchy itself has taken a stance of not replying to the Duke of Sussex, I suppose the Prime Minister would think, as the monarch's chief advisor, they also probably shouldn't comment. So that would be one reason. And in Labour's case, I suspect that Keir Starmer's genuine view of the monarchy is that he thinks it's a bit of a silly institution that he's never been that much in favour of. But that he wouldn't wish to destabilise either his electoral chances or his time in office doing anything about. So it's a subject he just doesn't want to talk about particularly. He probably doesn't have much interest in it, as a phenomenon. And insofar as he's ever had an interest in it, and I'm not saying this as a political point, I think this is just an observation about his attitudes. He's probably sort of quite against it, but that would obviously be completely counter to his political strategy. So for both parties, there really isn't anything in this. I think that would probably be the reason. There was one other reason, which is it may be that people haven't really asked that much. What are the instances on which you would be pressed? There's no shadow spokesman for the monarchy, so they don't have to say anything. It doesn't come up, the Duke's book isn't going to come up in Parliament. Keir Starmer hasn't given a big interview, and Rishi Sunak will be the monarch's chief advisor, won't want to say anything. So that's the other reason is, you need an occasion on which to be asked or to put this, and they haven't had one.
Well, in fact, this morning, Stig and Asma on Breakfast asked Grant Chaps, the business secretary, on Breakfast, if he'd be reading Prince Harry's book. Let's take a listen.
I was not planning to, as it so happens, or certainly not as an early priority, no.
Okay. No. You're obviously a busy man as the business secretary.
One or two other things to do, yes.
And that's basically the answer who's going to get them through this week, and then probably not after that. And actually, I suppose more broadly, the book is salacious. There's lots of gossip in there. It's a soap opera. There's no great constitutional crisis. What he hasn't done is revealed what Prince Charles, then Prince Charles, now King Charles, said about Rishi Sunak or Boris Johnson or something like that.
Yeah, but by the way, I know it's completely diverting the point, but Grant Shapps is quite good at giving interviews, isn't he?
Yeah.
He does actually usually know what how to give an answer to get through what are usually pretty sticky, let's face it, situations. Yeah. You see that a politician wouldn't want to get drawn in. What is the angle for him in that? He's just going to get himself into trouble one way or the other. And again, there is this constitutional relationship. He is the king's minister, so he doesn't want to get pulled into that. I do think it does say something about the book, which is that in the end, none of the things that he put in the book are really shake the foundation. For all it's been said as that he's shaking the foundations of the monarchy. I'm not sure it does the fact that
it shakes the foundation of their family, but that's
William,
a different question.
Tore his necklace. It's not going to bring down the monarchy.
No.
No, it's not. It's not as if when King Charles pops his clogs, as eventually we all will do, anybody's going to turn around and say, well, we can't have William as king because of the dog bowl thing. That's just not going to happen. So all this stuff about how it's a constitutional crisis, I agree with Danny, is for the birds. It was just that politicians quite often find it difficult to keep their opinions out of big questions which are exercising the public. And I'm really struck, not just how senior politicians are keeping out of this one, but how almost all of them are, actually, including the ones who are very kind of usually reliable for a big comment about something that they know nothing about.
It turns out they can do it. They can keep quiet if they really apply themselves. Right, let's turn our attention then to Grant Chaps' actual day job when he's not trying to avoid questions about Prince Harry. Government today introducing new legislation to Parliament for minimum safety levels during industrial action. David, it does feel a bit like, if in doubt, the Tories announce another crackdown on strikes.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what it is. So it's interesting. The government hasn't actually seen necessary to introduce these measures since it came in 12 years ago. So the question is why now? And the answer why now is because there are a lot of strikes. The then answer is, well, why are there a lot of strikes, and can we settle them? Not how do we go about trying to penalise strikers in some kind of a way, in a way that actually won't affect this latest raft of strikes, but may conceivably affect a lot of strikes in the future. The one thing that I was really struck by in the political terms was when Grant Chaps was going around saying, well, we've got to guarantee you can't have a situation whereby you can't get an ambulance if you're having a stroke, or you can't get if you've broken bones. And you thought, what on earth do you think's happening now? What would it be fair also, therefore, to introduce a service level guarantee that allowed you to sue the government if your ambulance didn't come on the same terms that you could force an ambulance driver to work in order to meet minimum service guarantees? This is it seems both unlikely to work. In fact, it is unlikely to work, because the way in which, as I understand, the legislation will work is that people would lose their employment guarantees, and in the kind of fields that we're talking about, we have a shortage of people to do those jobs anyway. So it would seem very unlikely to be enforceable. And I don't know what Danny's going to do with it when it comes to the House of Lords. I just don't see it as any kind of answer to the current situation. What it attempts to do is essentially put some kind of imaginary legal constraint in a situation which is essentially political.
So I have to admit that when this idea was first bruited in the Conservative circles, Ken Clarke used to always call this that stupid idea of Danny Finkelstein's. So I can't walk away from it entirely. Basically, the impulse behind it is that if you have a monopoly, you are able to exploit it in lots of different ways, and in public services that can often be through strike action. There is, however, as Ken Clarke was correctly pointing out, a real problem. The problem that Ted Heath faced when he introduced trade union laws that the trade unions didn't want to abide by, which is they simply broke it, and then you end up in a situation where you're trying to put people into jail. It's very difficult to have a unilaterally determined compulsion to do something. So I think you have to buy out those parts of the public services that you decide you don't wish to allow to strike. And I think without that, it becomes very difficult to implement. And I don't think the public will be behind it, or that it will be enforceable. But I do think there is some value in trying to do that in a number of different. My argument would be that we've already done that in railways, right? We've already given them the wages that kind of. And that it is not unreasonable to insist that there be some restriction on their monopoly power strike. But I'm not sure that it's true in other services, certainly not in ambulance driving. So if you do that, and it could be, by the way, a solution for the government, instead of giving in to the trade unions on their strike demand, they could give them some money to buy off their right to future striking for this minimum service guarantee, and solve both the problems that they're trying to solve at once.
An interesting point that Dave is making about what exactly is that minimum service, because the service, when there isn't strikes, particularly the NHS, is so bad at the moment. You know, the government could end up being sued themselves.
David rose a very good point. Well, I'm not against that, and people do put. So I favour a much more direct relationship between the money being put into the National Health Service and the outputs. I'm in favour of some sort of hypothecation, which is very unorthodox. But I think that the minimum service guarantee could go with that. And by the way, if you did that, you'd also have to allow the National Health Service to contract out those services, which a lot of people then say is privatisation. But I would argue isn't.
We'll have to leave it there. Fingers crossed. Well, assuming you're not both on strike, you'll be back next week. You back
Absolutely,
next week?
I am.
David, are you here next week?
I hope so.
It's a politician's answer if ever there was one.